Welcome to Second Saturday Conversation. This is a place where we talk about Christianity in and for the 21st century. I should say Christianities in and for the 21st century. There are many Christianities, as we know. And my sense of where Christianity is now is that it's in flux. It's the question is actually being called on Christianity. What are we talking about? What does it mean? What does it hope for? What does it promise? So we here on Second Saturday explore Christianity in the 21st century. And we also puzzle and wonder about Christianity for the 21st century. And our sense here is that if Christianity is going to speak to our future experience, which actually we don't know fully what that's going to be, but if Christianity is going to have something to say to us in the 21st century, our sense here is that Christianity needs to be reimagined, rethought, re-expressed, that the way that Christianity has been taught, the way that many people have been led to believe, that there's a chasm between some of the beliefs and our own experience of what it means to live in the 21st century. So at Second Saturday, we explore Christianity in and for the 21st century. Our sub-theme this year is called Evolution of the Word. All things change. All things change. And here, if you think about the word if you capitalize it, for some in the Christian tradition, that might suggest the Bible, it might suggest Jesus, it might suggest God. Or if you keep it as a lowercase word, it refers to language in its various contexts. The point being that all things change. Language and its meanings change too. Before I introduce our guest today, Brandon Scott, I want to say just a little bit more about language, and I'm going to draw from an opinion piece that was written in the New York Times by John McWhorter, who was a linguist, and I want to thank my friend Jarmo Tarkki for bringing this article to my attention. This is part of what he writes. This is John McWhorter. To think of language as a list of words with set meanings is like thinking of the position of the clouds right now as somehow fundamental, rather than as a passing moment. Words, meanings, are hopelessly motile, he says. So language and the meanings of language are not forever fixed. And in the sweep of history, we need to consider language and their meanings as John McWhorter says, a passing moment. He goes on to say, the cloud metaphor for words is instructive. Clouds endlessly shift, blend, split off new shoots, evaporate, and are born again. The fun is, he continues, is in looking back at how things have changed and always having an ear to what might be next. And I think this is descriptive of the mindset and curiosity of those of us who gather together on Second Saturdays. And we're particularly sensitive when talking about Christianity and Christianity for the 21st century, about words, the words of the tradition then and now, and do they still speak to our lived experience? I'd like to call on my friend and colleague Jeff Creswell to say a little bit about how we will do the plenary session today. After Brandon and I have had some conversation, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions of Brandon and Jeff. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the courtesies of the plenary? And by the way, hello, Jeff. I know that Jeff is zooming into us from Florida. He's at a conference. So nice to see you. I'm glad you're here.
Nice to see you too, Mary Ann. Good morning.
Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad that you all are here. Just a couple words about the plenary session. We've done it a couple of different ways, but where we are now, using the cloud metaphor as we change, as we go along, we're going to invite you to go down to the bottom menu bar in your Zoom where it says reactions. And down there, if you click, you'll see a little hand to raise. If you have a comment or a question that you would like to ask to Brandon or to Mary Ann, go down there, hit that hand, and you will show up on the top of my screen, and I will call on you when the time is right. I just want to make note of the fact that the order that you see people showing up with a hand raised on everyone's screen is different. So if I call you in an order that seems off from what you're seeing, just know that what I'm seeing is different. So we'll get to as many of you as we can. The other thing is that we have a lot of people here. We have over 400 people who are on this Zoom who are very interested in this topic. And so in order to give as many people as possible some time to be able to ask their questions, I'd encourage you to keep your comments to 2 minutes. One way to do that is to take the time before you raise your hand to compose what it is you want to say. And just as a way of keeping everybody honest, I'll keep track of that 2 minutes. And if we go over 2 minutes, I'll just put up a finger like this, which will be a gentle reminder that it's time to sort of wrap up what you're saying so that we can hear the response and go on and hear from other voices. So I think that's all I have to say, Mary Ann.
Great, great. Thank you, Jeff. That's really, really helpful. Nice to see you. So I'm delighted and honored to have Brandon Scott contribute to our conversation today. Brandon is the Dartmouth Distinguished Professor of New Testament Emeritus at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, that might locate him institutionally, but it really doesn't tell us much about him. You wouldn't know by that Brandon is also a birder and a photographer, and you saw some of his photographs, just a sampling of his 2023 calendar, some photographs as we started the slides this morning. And at the very end of our session today, the closing slide that we will show this morning is also a photo of Brandon's. So you wouldn't know that he was a birder and a photographer. You wouldn't know that he's the premier, arguably the premier scholar on parables and their rhetorical and imaginative function. He's also a leading scholar, Pauline scholar. He's done a lot of inquiry and exposition about Paul and the authentic letters of Paul. He's also central to the recent groundbreaking work of the West Star Institute, which has published this book, After Jesus, Before Christianity, which explores the first 2 centuries of of Jesus communities. And I'd like you to notice that my dear beloved dog, Theo, is also chewing on this. And so I encourage you to do the same. It's a really important book. Brandon is a central part. This is a 10-year project. Brandon has been a central part of that, and with 2 other colleagues, they wrote their research and discoveries into this book, and it's very accessible and it's really important. And Brandon and I'll address that. I'll ask Brandon about that in a little bit. Brandon was also one of the early members of the Jesus Seminar, as was Marcus. So Brandon knew Marcus. And as we know, the Jesus Seminar, which is part of the West Star Institute, it changed the conversation about Christianity. It raised a lot of questions. It brought it out of the ivory tower and brought the conversation around tradition and Christianity into the public square. And that was in the 80s. And I think that was one of the most important things that changed and opened the conversation that we are still continuing today. So that's thanks to Bob Funk and the Westar Institute. Brandon also has a real keen sensitivity to the lenses of the tradition, through which, if you consult the tradition, everything should be seen, should be viewed. He's not at all shy about talking about the trouble with resurrection. Now, resurrection is trouble, but the way that we tend to talk about resurrection as an element of creedal belief and emphasize individual salvation, paradoxically, the tradition itself has entombed the metaphor. And that's troubling. Brandon is a keen perceiver and interpreter of the New Testament and of the tradition. And to keep using the image of lenses, he provides us with a whole new set. And when we dare to look through the lenses that the work of Brandon Scott provides, we realize that we not only see things actually more clearly, but we see things very differently. And what we thought we were looking at, we realize is something else. So I am tremendously honored that Brandon is with us today, and I am eager to have him share with us some of his insights and thoughts. And without any further ado, let me bring, or have Jake, our technical person, bring to the screen Bernard Brandon Scott. There you are.
Good morning.
Good morning, Brandon.
I hardly recognize myself from that introduction, so.
Oh, well, I'm seeing it through my own lenses, which actually I think are pretty darn accurate. So, and anybody who knows you and your work, they recognize what I'm saying. So, Brandon, I want to start a conversation today by asking you to tell us a little bit about your own story and your own journey, and kind of, how you got to where you are. I know a little bit about your story, but two things in particular come to my mind. One is that you sparred with Cassius Clay before he became Muhammad Ali. And the other is that you sparred with Cardinal Ratzinger before he became a pope. And as I understand, he forbade you from teaching, or made it impossible for you to teach in certain settings. But what I never have heard about is any knockout punch from either one of them. So I'm curious to know where that fits into your story. And there's so much to explore, but if you're comfortable just letting us know, and people who may not be familiar with you personally, tell us a little bit about you, your self-reflection, your self-perception, things that have influenced you, what's really shifted your thoughts and direction, and how we find you here today. It's a pretty broad question, but have fun with it.
I'm never comfortable talking about me. I'm much more comfortable talking about a text. But I grew up.
Consider yourself a living document.
Yeah. I grew up in the West End of, as we say, Louisville, Kentucky, Louisville to the outsiders, in the Catholic ghetto. And you don't often think about Kentucky as a Catholic ghetto, but Kentucky was settled by English Catholics. My ancestors all came out of Maryland with the land grants, and right behind Daniel Boone. So you have three counties in Kentucky, Bourbon, Marion, and Davis, which are nearly 100% Catholic. And they all come out of that area. That's where all the booze was made. The rest of Kentucky was dry. And I grew up in that kind of English Catholic ghetto. And it's a peculiar form of Catholicism. It was a form that wasn't Irish, wasn't Italian, and wasn't German. We were the real Catholics, you know.
Yes.
We were the ones who were condemned for modernism. Catholic Americanism was the heresy, got condemned. That was the English Catholics because we owned our own churches. They weren't owned by the diocese. And so there's a long history here, and I come out of that kind of view. So I was raised Roman Catholic, and I still think of myself as fundamentally Catholic. That's my sensibility. And there's lots about that tradition that I value. Intellectually, I came of age in Vatican II. It has and continues to have a huge influence on me. I think it was the right direction. And the church had it followed, the Roman church followed that tradition. If Paul VI hadn't lost his courage, then John Paul and Benedict decided to go in the other direction, we would be a very different church. It'd be a very different world too, I think. But that's not what happened. And so that's been a kind of a personal tragedy and a kind of deep grieving in my own life, that sense of loss of what could have been, but wasn't. And it's because of Vatican II that, you know, I went to a Protestant divinity school, Vanderbilt, and got a PhD. So I was the first Catholic at Vanderbilt. I no longer consider myself Roman. I left that a long time ago. There's a kind of, for me, an odd contradiction in the title, Roman Catholicism. Katholikos in Greek means non-ethnic. Usually people say universal, but it's universal because it means non-ethnic. To call it Roman is ethnic, non-ethnic. That doesn't make any sense. That's an oxymoron. So there's a real deep problem inherent in that whole kind of sense. In the way Augustine refers to himself as Katholikos, that's the way I think of myself. But I don't think of myself as Roman. That's too imperial. I lost that a long time ago. So Vatican II has a huge influence on me, really profound in many ways. And I think I'm still there. I never recovered fundamentally from Vatican II. The second big influence was, quite frankly, the whole Jesus seminar, Westar. I was in Westar before it was Westar. I was in the original meetings that Bob Funk called before he ever decided to do it. So I gave the first paper at the very first meeting of the Jesus seminar. So I go way back in that, and it was a profound experience. I think those of us, Mark and all of us who went through this, we all described it as a postdoc. I mean, it was really hard-hitting, and very honest and very open, and in a way that scholarship seldom happens. Most of the time you go to a conference and a person reads a paper and nobody ever changes their mind. When you vote, you find out who wins and loses, who bought your idea and who didn't buy your idea. And that's a radical experience for most scholars. And that has stayed with me ever since. That's the way to do scholarship, is in collaboration, in the public, in front of people, where you find out where people stand. You just don't put your ideas out there and then go about your business. That model has fundamentally stayed with me. The third thing that really had a profound influence on me was in the early 90s here in Tulsa. I was blessed. I've been blessed my whole life with a number of really gifted students whom the churches have managed to eat up. But that's a different problem. I had a student, Methodist student, who was assigned by her bishop to deal with the AIDS crisis. And one of the ways she dealt with that was to establish a small community called the community, she called it the Community of Hope, that ministered to these people who were dying of AIDS. And there were a lot of young men dying of AIDS in that day. And they met on Sunday evening. And it very quickly became a community, not only for gay men, but for lesbian women. And the beginning of the kind of transgendered was starting, and that stuff was there. So it became a place where these people were safe, where they could talk about things, and where religion was viewed very differently. And she asked me to come one night and talk to them about the parables. And I was delighted to do it. And in those days, when I talked about the parables, one parable I almost always dealt with the parable of the leaven, because nobody knew what it meant. The other big parables, they think they know what it means, and then you got to fight all that stuff. But the leaven is a very interesting parable, because leaven in the ancient world is a symbol for moral corruption. It's not a good sign, it's a bad sign. And if the kingdom of heaven or the empire of God, or whatever you want to call it, is like leaven, like moral corruption, which a woman took and she conceals, you got one bad thing after another piling up here. It's not going in the right direction. And that's the point. That parable puts God on the side of what looks like moral corruption. Whenever I use that parable with ordinary middle-class church communities, they didn't like it. They're happy being righteous, and they think they are. And that parable kind of challenges all that. But in this group, a young man who was gay, and I had never met him before. We eventually became very close friends. Stood up to me and he said, "Okay, I get it. God's a fag."
Wow.
And that's exactly what that parable means. Kind of in our contemporary language, that it to say the kingdom of heaven is like leaven is to make a similar kind of force to say God is a fag. That doesn't go together. That's shocking. That makes you rethink the categories. He got it.
Wow.
I found out later that was a word he absolutely hated.
Mm.
You know, but that parable spoke to him in a way that said, you know, because I'm gay doesn't mean I'm bad. And I learned from that community and from that experience that I think that's exactly what went on in the early Christian communities.
Okay.
These early Jesus groups, that's what was happening. It was these people who were from the outsides, from the margins, who had been, a technical theological term, crapped on by society, who felt healing, welcoming. Crossan talks about commensality, sharing of food. That's what all happens in a community like that. I saw in that community people, they would get up at Joys and Concerns and give you their TA numbers. I knew who was sick, who was alcoholic, I knew all that stuff. You go to a regular church and hear Joys and Concerns, there's no Joys and Concerns. It's what they're willing to say out loud. These people were talking about life and death matters. You know, that community became for me a laboratory about how early Christianity developed and emerged. And when people tell me, you know, well, this, you know, you can't face this kind of hard stuff. I saw it faced and it grew. It healed people. It worked. That was a major kind of influence on my own thinking about, you know, how this could play out, how it's different, and how this language really worked in the ancient world. And it made me a very different person. It made me really think hard about how this stuff works. And I think it does work.
Wow. Say a little more about how this language works,
I think
how it worked in the ancient world, and how that might help us to think about how is our language about faith, trust, belief, whatever. What do we actually dealing with when we talk about languaging our experiences like this?
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation last week with Don Crossan and I and Charlie Hedrick. We're talking about parables and our early work in parables. And Crossan made the astute remark that he was always more interested in historical Jesus and that I was always more interested in the language. And he's right. He's absolutely right. I've never written a book about the historical Jesus because I don't care much. It's just not an interest. I don't think you can know much. But the language fascinates me because the language is the product of the community. It's not a product of the individual. Jesus is a kind of cipher for the community. It represents a community of these people. He's not the hero. That's a misreading, I think, of the tradition. He's one of them. These are oral groups. These are memorial groups. These are not writers. These are not authors in our sense.
Right.
This stuff is composed in community. And this language is a way in which you can explore the world in which you live. It's a language that offers you ways to get out of and imagine other possibilities of being.
Okay.
You can't be other unless you can imagine how to be other. So imagination is critical. Without imagination, we're stuck where we are. We can't figure out any way. You look at all the problems we got, we're not going anywhere. So you have to imagine somewhere else you can go, somewhere the way to be. And I think that's precisely what this language does. Over and over again, the parables, the aphorisms that come out of this Jesus community, they imagine different ways. Let the dead bury the dead says, we don't have to be concerned about all this other stuff. We can go do something else. That's exactly what something like that says. It pushes you to look at what you're committed to and where you're going to go.
So for you, Jesus as the storyteller is actually not as important as the story, as the stories that come forth.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something to me yesterday about that you wonder if the parables aren't conversations, that the parables in a sense speak or explore with one another.
Yeah,
Let me say more about that. How do you?
Well, you got 3 questions there.
There you go. Well,
okay, play it out this way. I'm a great fan of Emily Dickinson and Shakespeare. I love both. I'm not particularly interested in Shakespeare and nor is anybody else. It's his plays that count.
okay.
And numerous people have tried to figure out who Shakespeare is from his plays, and they don't get anywhere. Same thing's true about Emily Dickinson. Even when you read Emily Dickinson's letters, they read more as poems and not as letters about personal things. Scholars have noticed that over and over again. There have been several great biographies of Emily Dickinson that don't tell you much about her poetry. So when this close identification,
That's a nice analogy, I think.
this close identification of the person with the work that's a mistake. That's a literary mistake. It's called the autorial fallacy. And we make it all the time. But the language is important. And it exists in a community of hearers. Language doesn't exist with the speaker. It exists with those who hear it. So it's a community of hearers. That's what's going on here in the Jesus group. This storytelling and these aphorisms, these sharp aphorisms, is a community trying to be born, trying to grow up, trying to understand how it can be under really difficult situations. So it's the language that is primary, and it is the language that is creative and expressive.
Go ahead.
Well, I forgot my point, so that's okay. Getting old, you forget sometimes where you're going. So
Well, I had that problem when I was much younger as well. Just where am I going? The book After Jesus, Before Christianity, because there's so many interesting things that are talked about in this book about what the sense of what these early communities were about. And how you're describing communities, and even the experience that you had with the community with the AIDS community and all of that.
They call themselves the Community of Hope. I think the name
Of
is
hope.
important.
That's important, actually.
When
isn't
you're
it?
facing death, and you know they were having 2 and 3 funerals a week, and you call yourself the Community of Hope, that's an interesting choice of words.
Yeah. And would you say that the early communities that were gathering around Jesus, and because of what he was teaching, that they were also communities of hope in that
Yeah,
they
I
were
think hope's
standing
primary.
against empire? They were trying to find a safe place amidst a world of violence.
I think safe place is a good description of what these early communities, first 200 years, are about. It's safe space,
Okay.
safe from the empire. I think that's fundamental. I think that's one reason. I think the analogy to gay lesbian communities, their use of safe space is a good way analogically talk about these early groups. That's what they're about. When they're gathered together, they're safe. I mean, that's why Paul talks about the ecclesia, which gets translated as church, bad translation, should never be translated as church. The ecclesia does not exist until the community is in meeting. It doesn't exist as a building. It doesn't exist as some idea. It only comes into being when they meet, because that's when it becomes safe.
Mhm.
That's the safeness, the cohesion. And that's why, for example, when some have something to eat and others don't have something to eat, he goes after them. That's a denial of the safe space. That's a denial of the commonality. That's making it unsafe. So he says the church goes out of existence in that case. The ecclesia is no more.
Aha.
That's understanding community in a fundamentally different way
Yeah.
than we've gone about it today.
Well, because it's a social location.
Precise.
And what happens when that social location becomes identified with, if you will, the temple or the altar
Or
or-
an altar.
or the church?
Yeah. Then it becomes an institution.
Okay.
And I mean, there's a part of me that says Christianity was inevitable. That is, sociologically, communities always move to becoming institutions. You have this in companies. I mean, there's books written about, you have the charismatic founder, and how does the charismatic founder move his company to kind of institutionalization and bureaucratization without losing the charismatic character? Well, it's hard. It's really hard.
And, I think Houston Smith said, which I thought was really interesting, that institutions give religion and spirituality traction in history, is the way he put it.
Yeah.
And yet, how do you hear that and maybe sort of critique that? Because there's a downside to that.
I'm a little more inclined to go with Thomas Aquinas, Ecclesia Reformanda. The church must always be reforming itself. I think that's the right attitude. I don't think the institution is a help. It's the problem. And you always have to keep reforming it. It interests me, as a historian, and I'm fundamentally a historian. That's the way I think. Precisely at the time Constantine offers the bishops the great deal, monasticism, both in the East and the West, takes off in the desert and says, no deal. We're out of this. We're not into this. And for the next 300 years, church history is all about the bishops trying to control monks, because the monks aren't buying the deal. The West is a great example. Benedict goes off into the nowhere lands and socialism works. The monasteries become so successful, they control most of the wealth in the West. And then the Cistercians started reform. I mean, it's endless. It's absolutely endless. And that's the way it should be viewed. There's no final terminal point. The institution always wants to think of itself as the terminal point, but it's not. It's the problem, and you have to move on.
Yeah. Would you suggest that the good news is that these things are always changing?
The good news is they must always change.
Okay.
And if they don't, it's called death.
Mhm.
If things
Okay.
don't change, it's dead.
Right.
I'm sorry to point that out, but
Yeah, well, and that's right. When things stop, talking about the restless heart, that's exactly
Yes.
what you want.
Yeah.
You definitely want a restless heart. Yeah. Yeah, I'm really intrigued with the emphasis on community and relationships within the community, and that because this has nothing to do if I'm with doctrine and dogma and a checklist of beliefs. It sounds like, I mean, this has more to do with how we live with one another in the midst of and in the midst of empire.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the first 2 centuries, really until you get the end of the 2nd century, beginning with Tertullian, there's no belief in the first 2 centuries.
Right.
You can't draw up a list of things you have to believe. I mean, people want to say certain things, but we have whole Christian documents that don't mention Jesus.
Hmm.
You know, there's no agreement on any central title.
Okay.
Christos, Kurios, none of those titles, Kurios, none of those titles are central. They get used by various people in various ways. There's some don't use them, some do use them. Some see some form of resurrection as central. Most texts that associate with the Jesus movement do not mention resurrection.
Mm.
I mean, you think it's central, but go try to find it mentioned. It doesn't
Yeah.
get mentioned all that often.
Yeah.
So, I mean, where's the centrality? It's in the community, it's in the experience.
Right. Well,
Uh,
considering resurrection and that you don't find it anywhere, but tell me,
I didn't say
more.
anywhere. I said there's lots of places where you don't find it.
Okay, perfect. So tell me about the relationship between parable and resurrection, because I think that you have said that if it weren't for parable, there wouldn't be resurrection.
Yeah,
So unpack that a little bit, because I find that
virtually
very,
every New Testament scholar will argue with me about that, but they're wrong and I'm right. So
well, that's why we have you here. We're just delighted.
I think once you begin to understand, you had raised this issue of the parables as conversation. I really think the parables are talking to each other. I've done a lot of work in orality and how storytellers work and all that kind of thing. And generally, storytellers, if you argue with a storyteller, they don't argue with you, they tell you another story.
Uh-huh.
So my grandfather was like that. My grandfather in Kentucky was a storyteller, and he had about 22 stories. We, as kids, we all had them numbered. We would try to trick him with some kind of situation and figure out what story he was going to tell. And being from Kentucky, the grandkids was all bet on which one he was going to tell. And his stories actually got recorded by the Library of Congress. They're in that writers project that came through during the Depression. He was one of the Kentucky storytellers that got recorded. But he had a very small repertoire. It was very polished, but very small. The same thing's true about Jesus in these communities. We probably have most of the parables. It's a small group. You don't need a lot, but they work in combination. They don't work in isolation. That's the mistake I made in my big book, Here Then the Parable. It's an encyclopedia about each individual parable. I struggled with how they all, so the work I want to do now is how do they imagine this world? They're in conversation. Each one only represents an aspect of the kingdom. They don't represent the totality.
Okay.
So it's one way here, another way here. Oh, don't like this one? Try this one. I imagine if Jesus told you the parable of 11 and you said, oh, that can't be right, he'd tell you the parable of the treasure. Oh, that's better. It starts off with treasure. That's good. Although it's going to get you in the end because you're going to be stuck with that. I mean, they would just be this kind of endless back and forth that's going on. And It's like the old story of the blind man feeling the elephant. All these parables are like ways of feeling out where the elephant is. And so you feel out what this reality is. And it's that conversation. Now, how does that produce the resurrection?
Yeah.
The resurrection is not an event. It didn't happen on the third day. It's an enlightenment that came upon a group of people that Rome didn't win. That's the essence of the experience.
Mm.
That's what they mean. Jesus's crucifixion means Pilate won, Jesus lost. They say, no, that didn't happen. And then eventually they use a bunch of different Jewish metaphors to figure out what that means. But that takes time. That took a while to happen.
Because you suggest that
But the parable, I want to make the quick point. The parables, they convince these people in their experience of them
right.
that the outside world does not triumph, that Rome cannot crush you, that debt does not crush you. Listen to the Lord's Prayer.
Mm.
That give us our daily bread. Yes, in this community, you can have daily bread. So this is a different reality. And therefore, the experience of that different reality in community as real convinces them that Jesus's death is also not real. Doesn't mean he didn't die. They're not stupid. They're not fantasists. They know what happens.
So in a way, it was Empire's
still there.
It was Empire's defeat.
That's correct. The empire, and eventually they work this out in multiple ways. It becomes very fruitful.
Wow. Wow. So your sense is then that the parables are a continuing attempt to try to describe and imagine this other way of being.
What
as you say, and we even titled this session today, it doesn't have to be this way.
That's right.
Okay, so say a little bit about that.
Well, and this is why, to me, the language is the most important element here, not the person. The parables are a linguistic, metaphorical phenomenon about a symbol. The empire of God is a symbol. It's not a thing. That's where it differs from the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is a thing. The empire of God's not. The empire of God is an experience.
Right.
And so I think Jesus used the term empire of God, basileia tou theou, because he didn't know what it was. He didn't. It's when you're going to talk about some sense of the experience of the transcendent in your own life, you're out of words.
Right.
So you go to a symbol. So this is a metaphor about a symbol, about an experience. So you're getting in a linguistic quagmire, but that's the point. You are in a linguistic quagmire. There's no way to talk about and experience these things except that way.
Wow.
Because once you turn it into a thing, it becomes ideational, then you've destroyed it. It's gone.
Okay.
And that's always the temptation.
And our temptation, is to reify it.
That's correct. Once you reify it, in my mind, the ball game's over. Because that's why Aquinas is essentially right. You have to keep reforming.
Okay. So where do you, sort of moving to a second Saturday question, Christianity in and for the 21st century. What do you make of it? And do you think Christianity is it so reified that it's basically as good as dead now? Do you think that reform can continue? Do you think that communities, what do you think? What do you make of Christianity in this 21st century? And what do you make of the thought that there might be Christianity for the 21st century?
Yeah, you sent me an email saying you're going to ask me this question. And,
yeah, I know I did. I wanted to let you know.
I said, am I going to answer it the way I really think, or?
That's what I would prefer. Don't dissemble. But that's what Bob Funk would say, right? Don't dissemble.
Yeah.
But you
Um,
can
I-
play
I
it
think-
anyway.
I think Christianity's missed the boat.
Okay.
I really do. I just last week wrote a blog post on Benedict the 16th. He's a very bright man, was a very bright man. And he just went the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And he's really tried Francis's hands. Francis has done a lot of good things, but he's stuck. There's just things he can't deal with because Benedict tied his hands tight.
Yeah.
And that's what he wanted to do. So not just Catholicism, I just think Christianity in general, in its various forms, it missed the boat. It missed the boat with Galileo. It missed the boat with Copernicus. It missed the boat with Darwin. It missed the boat with Vatican II. It just keeps missing the boat. It just doesn't seem to be able to take that step.
Which is
And-
not the same as reform.
It just hasn't worked.
Right.
And now it's becoming a third world religion rapidly.
Mm.
And some people are excited about that, but you ought to think about that. If it's becoming a third world religion, that means those third worlds are going to come first world. And when that happens, they're going to do the same thing all over that
Yeah.
happened in Europe and the United States. So I just don't see how this plays out. I think Christianity has been too indebted and too well to its imperial past. It just doesn't seem to be able to get out of the imperial mode.
Mhm.
My question is slightly different. I want to know, where's the new religion? I'm not worried. I think there's going to be some kind of new religion come out. How it will come out, where it will come out. Every time we've had these kind of major shifts in culture,
Mm.
religion shifted too. And I think it will. I don't think people can live without religion. I
Mhm.
suspect we were evolved to believe. E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard biologist, had a great saying that humans didn't evolve to believe in biology. They evolved to experience wonder.
Oh, God, that's wonderful.
It's
This
a
is-
great line. And this is by a man who's very anti-religious. But he understands it. I think he's right. And so it's that sense of wonder. That's what I keep. Where is that popping out? And I think that's what I'm on the look for. I know I'm probably depressing most of your audience, but I don't see that Christianity as institutions has
Okay.
much future. I think they've opted, and in fact, I'm worried that they're going to become smaller, more conservative, reactionary, and maybe dangerous.
Yeah,
We've already kind of seen this in the United States, so
I think they're already getting there.
it's scary to me. But
Yeah.
I'm not worried about religion because I think we evolved for it. And
Love it.
somehow this need for wonder, this need for community experiences, I think has to find a way out. It has to find an expression.
And would you say that the early communities that gathered around Jesus were such communities?
Yes, I think that's exactly what you have going on
Okay.
in the first 2 or 3 centuries, first 2 centuries. And by the 3rd century, it's really starting to shift
Okay.
rapidly. But
So the chasm between the early communities and then what became quote unquote church or Christianity, it's great.
it's huge.
Okay.
It's huge. Constantine at Nicaea changed. There's this, question: who invented Christianity? Well, you can nominate a bunch of people, but to me, Constantine is, for lack of a better term, a good candidate. Constantine did a fundamental thing. Up until Nicaea in 321, Christianity in its various forms, and you have to talk about various forms. You had bunches of stuff going on, was primarily a religion of practice. It's what you did that counted, not what you believed. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount doesn't tell you a thing to believe. You've got a lot of things that want you to do. You know, and you look through the New Testament, what do you got to believe? Not much, but they're pretty heavy on ethics. Ethics is important. How do you live? How do you create life? How do you community? Those are the issues they're dealing with. Constantine changes that. Nicaea says that's not as important as what you believe. So now we throw people out of church for what they don't believe rather than what they do. I'm sure Mark had this question, and I used to get it too. You know, when you have to do things in public, people try to do what I call the orthodoxy test. They'll say, do you really believe that Jesus is the second person of the Blessed Trinity? As if my answer to that question would tell you anything.
Right. Anything about anything.
About anything, you know?
Yeah.
And I would always reply that I will tell you my answer to that question when you tell me when you're going to sell everything and give it to the poor. And people would say, oh, he didn't really mean that. I had
Right, because
got a lot better proof for that one than you do for the other one. So
yeah.
see, praxis. It's about praxis in that point. So when was the last time somebody was thrown out of a church for not giving everything to the poor?
Yeah.
Constantine changed it to the point that religion became about faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
Christianity is the only religion that thinks religion is about faith. Judaism doesn't. It's
Right.
about what you do. Buddhism doesn't. Islam doesn't. Their religion is a praxis. We ought to rediscover praxis.
Okay. Okay.
That's my Constantine.
That's great. Let me, I do want to move to plenary because I know that we've already got a whole bunch of people who are just eager to engage you. But if I may, I want to ask you the second Saturday question, and which is, can you name an experience that shattered your horizon of expectation?
Oh, I've already named it. It's when Michael stood up and said, God's a fag. That
Okay.
shattered mine.
Okay.
I had been thinking about this language, and I thought I really understood that language, and I did understand that language. I'm not minimizing what I did, but he concretized it in a way that just shattered. I thought, oh, wait a minute now. This starts to make sense. This is how it really works.
Okay.
That was fundamental.
Wow. Great. Great. Brandon, are you at a point where you can take some questions or
Sure.
thoughts from others? Okay, that'd be great.
Or disagreements, you know.
Or disagreement, absolutely, yes. Folks who attend Second Saturday know that we have a 10 guidelines for listening and talking. I'm not going to take the time to review those today. But as Jeff, why don't you just say a little bit one more time as we move into plenary about making our comments about your finger. Are you there, Jeff?
About Jeff's magic finger.
About Jeff's magic finger. Yes, magic Jeff's finger.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a brief reminder that we ask that you compose what you have to say or ask ahead of time before you put up your hand by clicking on that bottom reaction button, and that you limit your statement or your comment or your question to to 2 minutes, which I will be timing so that we stay on schedule, and to know that the order of the hands being raised on your screen may not be the same as on mine. So wait patiently if you don't get called on right away.
Yeah.
So
thank you so much, Jeff, for helping to navigate this. I really appreciate it.
yeah, you're welcome, Marianne. Let's start with Carl. Carl, can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Yes, I would like to, I remember Leslie Penrose in the Community of Hope very well. She had a very important influence on my way of thinking. Could you say something about the contributions of John Shelby Spong in trying to determine where we ought to be going?
Yeah, I wrote a blog after Spong blog of appreciation for him. I admired Spong. As a New Testament scholar, I thought he was a bit bonkers. And I don't think I was alone in that. I think many of us did. But I admired his courage as a
We
bishop.
called him a provocateur.
Well, that's one way to look
That's
at
your
it.
word.
But what I admired about him is, most bishops reach this height of power where they can actually say something and they shut up. Or they probably get to there because they're not talking. They're not, and so it's a kind of waste. But I admired Spong. He was trying to say these things are serious and we need to take them seriously. I didn't, and I admired him. And I admired him because he was helping a lot of people who wanted to somehow belong to these institutions, who had derived value out of them, but were being crushed by them. And he was saying, okay, you can recover from this. I admired him. I've only met one or two bishops who are anything like Spong. Most of them are cowards. I hate to say that. They're good people. I don't think for the most part, they're bad people. Most of them are good people, but they're institutionalists and they don't want to ask these hard, difficult questions. If they don't want to ask them, why not let us ask them? Why try to keep us quiet? So, but I admire Spong for that. And I stood up for him. I had fellow scholars who would say, well, this stuff about Matthew, that's nuts. Well, I think it is too, but I don't let him say it. That helps people. And he's speaking up and that takes courage. He had to speak out. And frankly, he put on his collar and his purple shirt and he had more credibility than I do. Who am I? I'm just me. Who do I represent? Me, nobody else, that's it. Spong represents church authority in a way that no scholar can do. And he was willing to use it and I appreciate it.
Mm. Mm.
Thank you.
And I
you.
think the church would have been better off if it had followed him.
Thank you, Carl.
Yeah.
Let's go to Celine Burke. Celine, can you unmute yourself?
During transition, we usually don't know what's happening. Where do you imagine religion in the 22nd century?
And I'm going to be perfectly honest. I'm a historian. I was trained to stare firmly into the past. Anything past the 5th century is just completely modern for me and out of context. I'm not trying to be silly. I have no idea. I don't, will we as a species make it 100 years? I think it's a legitimate question.
I do too.
I don't think that's a given. And I don't think Elon Musk is going to escape to outer space on his rocket ship. It's not going to happen. We're stuck here on this planet. And if we don't figure out how to deal with it, that's why these texts are still relevant. They're talking about how we deal with this, how we develop community. If we don't figure out how to do this, it's not going to be a pretty future. But I am not a futurist. I am not a prophet. I'm a historian. I'm buried in the past. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm looking for something new, but I'm probably looking in the wrong place in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Thank you, Celine. How about Jel? Jel, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I think you've already, to a certain extent, answered this question, but I'd like to reframe it. Each morning at church, we go through and say the Nicene Creed. And it's so full of what I would call religious dogmatic symbolism. And I think it has lost its power and it's sort of transfixed transfixes you and nails you to the time period in which it came. I was wondering, what is your general comment about maintaining the various Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed or the Athanasian Creed as something that should be done? And if we, I think your answer is no, but does it have a historical value in the church?
Good question.
Well, it has a historical value, but I don't know what necessarily. I don't think I don't like the word in the church. The church is a reification of something that really doesn't exist. So but it has historical value. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Alfred Loisy, who was a French Catholic modernist biblical scholar. Loisy once said, I'm going to do it in English, that the only thing true in the Apostles' Creed was suffered and died under Pontius Pilate. And everything else he said was metaphor.
Right.
He's right. So my take is slightly different. Why does tradition begin in the 5th century? Why start it in the first? Why skip the first 4 centuries? I don't get that. It doesn't make any sense to me. That's the golden age. If you know.
So
So-
basically what I'm hearing is that creeds lock you in, well, I think agrees with me, they lock you into a past, though they're not forward looking because they
They're
do
not forward looking. And the other reason you have to, why did Constantine want a creed? Constantine wanted a creed because what Constantine was about was unifying the Roman Empire.
Right.
The Roman Empire was badly divided and he needed a new ideological cement. And he chose Christianity. The only problem was Christianity wasn't unified. So he viewed the creed like the oath that the military took to the emperor.
Mm.
In the Roman Empire, beginning with Augustus, the Roman legions took an impersonal oath of loyalty to the empire, to the emperor, not the empire, not Rome, but to the emperor. And that's what Constantine wanted. He viewed the creed as an oath of loyalty, and its purpose was to eliminate those who weren't loyal. That's still its purpose.
Right.
So that strikes me as an imperial, outdated model. Where should be, if we're going to have a political model in the church, I'm for democracy.
Mhm.
That's the model. I don't want an imperial model. So I, for example, refuse to say the Lord's Prayer. I'll pray Jesus's peasant prayer any day of the week, but not the Lord's Prayer. I'm not interested in masters and slaves. That day's over. Let's move on. Do something else, okay? Not
Mhm.
interested in creeds. That's, we don't need this imperial stuff. If you're going to talk about Jesus as a friend. That has perfectly good depth in the tradition. John's all over that. We don't need this master-slave language. I don't want to talk to my pastor. I'm not sheep. I'm just not going to buy this stuff, And we need a more radical, if Christianity wants to survive, I'm not sure it does, but if you want to survive, you've got to eliminate this outdated language. And it's a lot of language. It's not a little bit, it's a lot.
Right.
Hmm.
But there are resources in the tradition. There are plenty of resources in the tradition
Hmm.
that are there, but it takes work to get to them.
Thank you, Del.
Oh. Yeah. Brandon, I remember being in the parish and I remember somebody saying to me that they would rather see Christianity die than change.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Mhm.
Plenty of people think that.
Christianity that they knew that they thought was Christianity,
Yeah,
right?
that's sure and certain.
Yeah, right,
That's of course an illusion,
right.
but that's the way they feel about it. You can read Russ Duat in the New York Times. He'll tell you that about every third week. In
Yeah.
his editorials, okay, fine. I'm glad the New York Times gives him space, but how about some theologians who think differently? Why aren't they in the New York Times?
Yeah.
So the only thing that represents Christianity in the New York Times is its conservative version.
Yeah,
Why not something on the other side?
Yeah.
Come on, Brandon.
It's not me. They do have a young woman from Nashville who occasionally writes about her faith. I forget her name right now. She really is quite elegant. And
Okay.
I look forward to when she talks about that. She does a good job.
Hmm.
I'll have to get her name.
Great.
How about Lynn Tolk? Lynn, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Brandon. This has been so exciting. I'm having a wonderful time. I don't come from the church originally. My mother was anti-church, so I grew up curious. Consequently, I've been studying all that stuff ever since. I was probably, did I get unmuted because my
No, no,
little.
no, you're fine.
You're
You're fine.
Okay, good, thanks. I received a whole lot of hope when I read a book called The Common Heart that is an edited compilation of remarks from people who Father Thomas Keating brought together back in the 80s for a 20-year period. Once a year, they would get together for a week and just dialogue. And these were people from 8 different world traditions. And they started out expecting to find lots and lots of differences, and they ended up finding, well, a few maybe, but they had 8 points that they all agreed on. And the encouraging thing about it, his belief was that all this attempt at dialogue back in the 80s was all public, and it was more like performance art. And you don't really get to depth that way. So they did not record anything except on paper, and then they talked about it afterwards. But I was so excited when I read that. And the other, I was also quite thrilled with the theologian Raymond Pottekar, because he ended up in the same place. He said his mother was a Roman Catholic, his father was a Hindu. So he went deeply into both traditions. He said, I started out a Christian. I found my roots in Hinduism. On the way, I studied Buddhism. And he says, and I ended up back where I started. So I think that there is hope for something new coming, and maybe even here. Thank you.
Well, you know, Tom Keating was a serious thinker. And I mean, I think all the religions right now, there's one way that they can all get together, and that's at the level of mysticism. And that's what Keating was moving towards.
Right.
Whether that's going to fly, I think is still an open question.
Yeah.
But that there is the monastic tradition is a common religious tradition that transcends all the various specifications. And you see the same thing in Thomas Merton. He went exactly the same way at the end of his life. And it would have been interesting to see where Merton would have gone had he not died so young. But, you know, monasticism is one way to deal with this. And it's actually a way that is attractive to me in many ways. I come out of a kind of monastic tradition. So I taught at a Benedictine school for 16 years. So I have a lot of appreciation for monasticism. But I think it's not a universal way. You need something else.
Yeah. Thank you, Lynn. Let's go to Ron. Ron, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I just first want to say to Marianne and Brandon, this has been great. So thank you very much. My question is for Brandon. I read your book, which I think is fantastic. And because you were raised Roman Catholic and you're a historian of the first 500 years, I was wondering, you may be the best person for this question. In your book, Before Christianity, you're kind of saying there's really wasn't a consolidated hierarchical institution. Would the Catholics not like that because they say they go all the way back to Paul and Peter? Peter. Or is it what you're saying in the book is that it just wasn't a hierarchical institution that it mandated a creed until later?
Well, there's a couple ways to look at this. The myth that one of the things that the book wants to argue is that Christianity doesn't start until the 3rd century.
Right.
So I think the book has well established that. That's not particularly controversial among scholars. It's pretty controversial among non-scholars, but that's not a highly controversial statement among scholars. So I think that's well established. You can't trace it back because there's no linear. That's a false theory of origins, that you've got some seed that grows. Now you got a bunch of different things. They're not connected. Some fall out. There's no connection. So you can see connections if you're on the other end, but you're creating them. They're not there in any kind of linear sense. I think I ironically, the other day I was going to pick a friend up for lunch and I was listening to NPR and they were interviewing these 2 women, very good scholars who had gotten into the Vatican archives. Francis just 6 months ago released the archive for Pius XII. So we get all this stuff about Nazi Germany is coming out now. It's going to
wow.
change stuff quite. And they were talking about working in the Vatican archives, and they bought these are bright women who have good secular educations, very good scholars, and they talk about the 2,000-year history of the Vatican archives. There's nothing in the Vatican archives that goes back 2,000 years. There's nothing that goes past the 12th century. I've been there. But they kind of buy this myth, that it goes all the way back. No, it doesn't. And you really have to just kind of cut that one off. It doesn't. It's just not there. And that has to cease and desist. The other thing I think that's really important to understand about the first 2 centuries is they're making it up as they go along.
Right.
These are experiments. These communities are experienced, and some of them are dead end. Probably a lot of them were dead end. When you read Paul, he doesn't have a catechism. I like Paul. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's making it up.
Mhm.
He's trying to figure out what the heck to say. And, he says one thing and it has this outcome. So then he's got to correct it. He tells them there's neither male nor female. And then they start sleeping around. He says, wait a minute, that's not exactly what I meant. So you got to keep adjusting the program because you don't quite know what it is. You're trying to figure it out. Well, when you read the New Testament as revelation, that idea that these are experiments goes out the window. You're not even thinking about that, but it really is. They're experiments.
Yeah. Thank you, Brandon. There have been
Thank you.
several comments in the chat about asking if you would say what Jesus' peasant prayer is.
Well, the closest version of it is in Q. So if you look up Luke, the Lucan version of the so-called Lord's Prayer, you'll see it. It's pretty close. It start out with Father and not our Father in heaven. Father, especially if that's Abba, is a quite different person than our Father who is in heaven. Our Father in heaven is a hierarchical figure. Abba is your daddy.
Right.
Very different people.
Yeah.
So if you talk about forgiving your debts, that's very different from forgiving your sins.
Right, for sure.
So you get a whole lot of different things. If you talk about don't put it to the test, they're saying we got enough. We can't handle any more.
Mhm.
So daily bread is real food. So if you look at it from that kind of sense, it's a peasant prayer. People under pressure from the huge taxation programs is going on in Galilee, in that period, and they're saying no, we can't take any more. Okay, I know people who can pray that prayer today.
Yeah. Yeah.
See, we have a Federal Reserve that is raising interest rates. Who gets hit hardest by the interest rate? Read the newspapers, it's business. No, it's people with credit card debt. Poor people. They're the ones that get hit the hardest. There's
Right.
more of their income gets hit by that than a corporation. They'll just pass it on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these things are about real things. They're not about abstractions.
Yeah.
Mm.
Let's go on to Bruce. Bruce, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, in 1990, I joined the Jesus Seminar, and I really appreciated Brandon, your participation, and just fantastic. But your statement, I don't care about the historical Jesus, sort of through a loop. I mean, the Jesus Seminar was an expression of the quest for the historical Jesus, but maybe you're more like Rudolf Bultmann. You don't think you can get back beyond the text, beyond the confession of the church or the early followers of Jesus to Jesus.
No, that's not quite. I'm proud to call myself a Bultmannian
Okay.
because I was trained as a Bultmannian. Vanderbilt was a very Bultmannian school. But there's not much I hold in common with Bultmann anymore, to tell you the truth. I've really moved in many different directions. So what I'm trying to say is this language is not created by a single individual. It's created by a community. It's like talking about Homer. These are oral communities. These are communities of memorial culture. They exist in sound, not writing. And that was the problem with the Jesus Seminar, is it was still too much caught up in a print culture and not enough in a or understanding these things as oral cultures. And I was a part of that. So even then I wasn't particularly interested in the historical Jesus, but I know how to do the stuff. Okay, I can play. But these are, Homer is the cipher for the community of oral poets who produced the Iliad and the Odyssey. They represent a group, not a person. The same thing's true about Jesus. Jesus represents, in this case, not a person. He is a person, but the community that gave birth to this stuff. That's what I'm interested in. And I, Don and Mark were very much interested in historical Jesus.
Right.
I don't quibble with that. I don't quibble with their work. I like their work a lot. I'm indebted to their work. Not my interest. That's why I didn't write a book like they did. I wrote they didn't write a book like I did. So it's a different interest. It's a different slant on trying to get at this material. And so there's not one way. I don't think my way is particularly right. It's just the way I'm exploring this material.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
An interesting thing here is Paul wrote letters. And we can get at those. Now, we don't have any of those letters. And every Pauline letter we have now has been edited. So they have to a certain sense, be unedited. So that's a task that's being done now. Jesus didn't write a parable. There's a difference there. If you think about it, that's a fundamental difference between Paul and Jesus, and between parable and a letter.
Interesting.
Very good.
Thank you, Bruce. Liliana Stahlberg, you want to unmute yourself?
And I don't want anyone to take this question in the American understanding. I am curious about similarities between communism, as described by Engels and Marx and Engels, and early Christianity as philosophies of how to be in the world. Yeah, that's it. The similarities, because for me, true Christianity would be true communism. Yeah, but it's not the American understanding of communism.
Yeah,
you
if
know.
you understand the Marx and Engels, which is really a kind of a socialism,
It's socialism,
Yeah.
exactly.
then there are strong elements of that in early Christian. The difference is Marx and Engels' understanding of socialism is the organization of a total society.
Mhm, mhm.
In the first 150 years, none of these people are thinking about organizing the total society. That's already organized. It's called the Roman Empire, and they're
Oh.
against it. Okay, what they're interested in organizing is community life on a very localized scale. So, and that's a fundamental difference between Marx and Engels. But the commonality, Crossan is one who's really explored this quite a bit with his notion of commensality, which I think is very important for Crossan in his work. And I think he's basically right about how he's working that out. I think it's deeper than Dom does, but he's basically right. And that has a lot in parallel with Marx and Engels. It's just they're organizing a very different kind of social structure, I think.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank you. I realized there were two Bruces when I called on Bruce, so this time I'm going to call on Bruce Robertson. Bruce.
Thank
Great.
you. And Brandon, I'm very moved by your presentation. Very heartwarming, and thank you. My question is about Paul. He starts off as a card-carrying Jew and killing the Christians. Then he has his mystical experience on the Damascus Road, and he remains in major conflict with the Jerusalem community who were close to the historical Jesus. And then he seems to have been party to making a religion of salvation based on human sacrifice, following on the tradition of the temple. What do you make of that kind of Paul?
That's not Paul.
Yeah.
First of all, I think Paul was a card-carrying Pharisee and he remained a card-carrying Pharisee. Paul didn't convert, he was called. I think Paul remains a Jew and he sees himself fundamentally operating within Judaism. So that one is, I would really have a very different reading of Paul at that point. Secondly, I don't think the group in Jerusalem is particularly close to the historical Jesus. I think the group in Galilee is much likely closer to the historical Jesus. That's the Q group. The best example we have of the Galilean Christianity would be the Q group. The Jerusalem group is under James. As far as we can tell, James had nothing to do with his brother. They didn't get along. So I think there's some family stuff going on there, but that's a different kind of issue. I don't think Paul tries to create a religion of sacrifice. I think Paul's an apocalypticist. I think the reading of the sacrifice, that's a much later reading, almost mid-2nd century, back onto the Pauline letters. That's not what Paul's about. When Paul talks, like in Romans 3:21, when he uses the sacrificial language there, that's right out of Maccabees. That's the martyr language. The martyr sacrifices his life. He gives his life for the group. That's Maccabean language. That's the same as Martin Luther King when he says, he's giving his life for his cause. It's not a sacrifice in that. It's not temple substitution. The temple sacrifice has nothing to do with that. That's a later Christian. This is a multi-question here. Temple sacrifice has to do with making one right with the world. Forgiving your sins is easy in Judaism. You just create restitution. You pay the thing back. So it has nothing to do with the temple. That's a very different kind of phenomenon. So I'm sorry, I kind of fundamentally disagree with the principles implied in the question. So
That's all right.
I went in a different direction. I would recommend you read my book on Paul, Mark Nanos' stuff on Paul, which is really good. Elizabeth Eisenberg's book, Pamela Eisenbaum's book. Those books are really to the core here about what these issues are.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Marianne, do we have time for one more question? Or,
Well, I have us at really close to 11 o'clock. Do you,
oh, okay. Let's let's.
is that right? Is that about, are we close to 11?
Yeah.
We will, Brandon is willing to be with us during coffee time though, which will start in about another 4 minutes. So realizing that there are some folks who would like to, are those of you who are sort of waiting to ask a question, are you all available to spend a few more minutes in coffee time? Would that be all right? Yep, I see. Okay. Then lovely. All right. Then what we'll do, Brandon, is that when we go into coffee time, we'll invite some of those questions that weren't able to be asked during this time. That would be great. Let me make a couple of quick announcements. One is that our next second Saturday will be April 9th. It's the anniversary of Bonhoeffer's death. It's also Holy Saturday. And I think that's a really interesting day in the liturgical year. And in many ways, I think that that's where we live. But April 9th will be our next second Saturday. This coming Saturday, the 18th of March, we will have our third small group opportunity, which we call Third Saturday Reflection. And that's for those of you who enjoy being part of a small group conversation and so forth. Those invites will go out on Monday. I want to quickly note something about Jack Caputo, who has been a guest here at Second Saturday. He is going to be honored at Duquesne. Thank you, Jake, for this. At Duquesne University on April 13th and 14th. This is the title of the symposium, Phenomenology, Theology, and Theopoetics. And there will be the dedication of an archive. That is the John D. Caputo Archive at the Simon Silverman Phenomenology Center. So that will also be taking place on April 13th, 14th. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that to your attention. It'll be an in-person event as well as an online event. And finally, today is Marcus Borg's birthday. He was born March 11th, 1942. He would have been 81 today. And Brandon, if you would be so kind, because you knew Marcus, if you would say a word or two about Marcus Borg on this March 11th.
Well, I considered Mark a good friend.
He felt the same way about you.
We were together from the early days of the Jesus Seminar. But I have two kind of strong remembrances of him.
Okay.
I always thought Mark, of the group that came out of that Jesus Seminar, was by far the best public presenter.
Mm.
He had a way of dealing with people's questions that got to the heart of the issue without scaring them to death. And he could make them see how the question worked. If you've listened for me very long, I scare people to death. So he was really good at that. And I saw him once. He gave the Ministers' Week at Phillips. He did a great job, and it was on resurrection. And he was paired with a theologian who was a kind of neo-Barthian, who did a very neo-Orthodox thing. And Mark just gently took him apart and said, that's not what the New Testament has to say. And I thought the ministers were going to come unglued. And one of them got up and said they really appreciated Mark for, yeah, that's right. Nobody believes that stuff. So it was really liberating. I mean, his finesse at handling it was just magnificent. He was by far the best at doing that. But during that time when he was here in Tulsa, I shepherded him around, and he kept worrying because my tank only had a quarter of gas. And he was really worried that we were going to run out of gas. And so I said, "Why are you so worried about the gas tank? That's my problem." And he said, "Well, my wife's family is in the oil business, and I got to keep them in business." So
I did not know that story. That's great. Yeah, my father always told me to keep a half a tank of gas.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's where it came from. He was on me to keep a half a tank of gas.
That's great. That's great. Yes, and I agree with you. Marcus had a clarity and a graciousness, but he did not lack for a failure of nerve.
No, I wasn't saying that, but
No, you didn't say that. Yeah, yeah. So thank you. For our closing music today, I was a student of Mark's. I was a college dropout from University of Oregon. I was an English, Lit, and theater major, dropped out. 14 years later, I come back to the other school, Oregon State University, and a major in religious studies. And Marcus was assigned as my advisor. And so I want to, let me also do this before. This is a photograph of Marcus when he was a little guy. I don't know if you can see this, but here he's holding on to a suitcase. Okay, so early on, Marcus, here he is at his front door holding onto a suitcase. Marcus was almost a 2 million mile flyer. So from the very beginning, I think that he realized that he had to cast his eyes to a broader horizon, and he had his suitcase in hand. And I love this little photograph of him. Anyway, the closing music for today that I am picking in light of this being Marcus's birthday is James Taylor singing "Teach Me Tonight." And thank you all for being with us. Brandon, it's a joy to be with you. Brandon and I will join you in about 4 minutes for those who can be with us for a slightly extended time. So look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you. And Brandon, thank you for that last photograph. On the morning Mark died, I took our dogs out for a walk and actually saw a sundog in the sky. So it's a nice image. And by the way, a correction, and I noticed it in the chat. Our next second Saturday is April 8th. That Saturday is the 8th. April 9th is Bonhoeffer's death date, but April 8th, Saturday, will be our next second Saturday. Okay. Thank you for your patience for those who had additional questions, and we'll get to you now. So Jeff, do you want to help us out, continue to help us out? I so appreciate, Jeff, your presence and just guiding us through our conversations. I appreciate it.
It's lovely. It's lovely to be a part of it. And there's a great comment in the chat here. Somebody wrote, "The time today was like finding a safe place of refreshment for the heart."
Oh
Thank
my, oh my.
So thank you to both of you for offering us that safe place of refreshment for the heart.
So Brandon and I so we've all experienced that as community today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you have a chance to look at these comments here, you'll see that many people experience that community. And isn't it amazing that we can have that community virtually?
I know. I agree.
So, Brandon, just thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. It's been really a gift for all of us.
my pleasure.
So let's go back up here to Pam. Pam, you have your hand up. You want to unmute yourself? There we go.
Hello, and thank you very much. First of all, I want to say to Brandon, I thoroughly appreciated After Jesus Before Christianity. I really liked the book. And then before I offer my question, I need to name, I am Canadian, born into the Baptist Church, but raised into and living out at the United Church of Canada, liberal Christian. So having said that, I have known since I was a teenager, and my father was a pastor, that people in training for ministry learned new ways of understanding scripture, of reading scripture, of new approaches to theology, all those things, and they have been afraid or reluctant to share them from the pulpit. And my father included. And my feeling is that is part of the problem with why the church is dying. So I'm saying now, 50 or more years later from that, my original conversation with my dad, what can we do to encourage our ministers to be brave enough to share what they're learning?
I don't know. I taught my entire career in seminaries and never solved that problem. And I'm serious. I mean, I remember as a young scholar talking to a group of Roman Catholic clergy about the parables and everything, and they were very excited and liked it. And they said, one guy said, this stuff is really interesting. This is, man, this will really change things, but I can't tell my people this.
Yeah.
And you constantly get that. That's been the constant refrain I've had for 40 years or more. And it's, that people, I saw this over and over again. It was students who would be really good students, and 5 years out in the ministry, they either left or they were ground up and they were back to talking pablum. Because if once you say something, then you got problems, and it just, so I don't know. Spong was really good about this. He used to talk about, you should just get rid of those one or two people who stop everything in the church. They're killing it. But they're probably a donor, or they go to the bishop, or, it's just, yeah, it is a huge problem. And I hate to say it, I spent my whole life in seminaries and we never figured out how to solve that problem.
Right.
So as a result, seminaries largely failed.
Well, thank you. That makes me feel less alone anyway.
No, it's you're quite, yeah. And there's an odd side to this. I know a lot I know a lot of ministers who retire and they end up in Unitarian churches.
Yeah.
Where they can actually say what they want to say.
Yeah.
Why didn't they say it before?
Yeah.
That's why I admired Spong. He said it, and he paid a price for saying it too.
Yeah. Yeah. Brandon, I'll be so bold as to say, I don't know that you failed as a seminary professor. I think that we clergy failed.
Well, I never figured out, and I never saw a seminary curriculum that figured out how to give these students the courage to do that. And I don't think, the judicatories never figured it out either. It's a massive problem.
Agreed.
Thank you very much, Pam. Let's go on to Evelyn. Evelyn, can you unmute yourself?
First, I want to, in honor of Marcus, mention that it's because of him I found the Jesus Seminar and have appreciated beyond words what I have gained from that. And you too, Brandon. So good seeing you again.
Excellent.
Yeah, great.
Off topic, recently in the public square, West Star Public Square, you were talking about Ratzinger, and you answered a question saying he was not a fundamentalist, but a traditionalist. Would you explain the difference, please?
Yeah. Fundamentalism is, first of all, an American phenomenon primarily. And if fundamentalism has certain fundamental principles that it accepts, chief of one of which is there's no salvation except through Jesus. The Bible is literally true. There's a whole series, there's 12 of these fundamentals that are, and fundamentalists pretty much have continued to cohere with that. Now, fundamentalism gets used in a metaphorical sense, to refer to a lot of different things, but religiously, that's what fundamentalism. Ratzinger's not that. He doesn't believe the Bible is infallible. He thinks the Pope is.
I love your humor.
Well, and he's a traditionalist, and for him, the tradition really revolves around Augustine, big time Augustine. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on Augustine and Bonaventure. So it's the early Thomist. He's not a real he never was a classical Thomist. Thomas would be a little too radical for Ratzinger, but he's a traditionalist. He's not a fundamentalist. He does not think salvation only comes through Jesus. He doesn't have any problem with Lutherans being saved or even Buddhists in that. He's a little problematic on Islam, but Buddhism, for example, Judaism, Ratzinger was really quite open to Judaism. So he's not, I think it's not fair to class him. I disagree with Ratzinger at almost every point, but I also want to be fair to who he was. And I don't think he was a brilliant theologian, but he wasn't a dumb theologian. He knew the tradition well.
Thanks.
Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Thank you. Before I go to the next person, I just want to make a comment that the chat is just bursting with reasons for why pastors don't speak what they learn in seminary. And they have to do with things like losing their job or being commanded by their bishop, or one person who just said, you lose congregants, the church, the diocese loses money, ugh.
Yes. All of those things are really true. I used to tell my students, you want to follow Jesus. Well, remember, he had a short and rather unsuccessful career.
Yes. Amen to that.
I have decided to follow Jesus. No looking back.
Careful what you wish for. How about Warren? Warren, can you unmute yourself?
Thank you. I have just been sitting here typing out a chat, which I was going to send on the chance that I wasn't able to get through, but I'm so grateful I can just read it now to you. And Marianne, I was fortunate to meet you and Marcus in 1990 when I entered my first year of seminary at Pacific School of Religion.
Oh my goodness.
And actually, I met him before that year at the administrators conference for people who were considering going to Pacific School of Religion, and he was influential in my doing 4 years at PSR.
Right, yeah.
And becoming a minister, and I could react to all of the comment about what happens with ministers and not being able to speak the truth.
He taught New Testament there when somebody was on sabbatical, and Marcus was able to teach at PSR. So
I took both Christian scriptures, Hebrew scriptures, and his New Testament course in the first 2 semesters. He was there, and my son helped you move from your house 3 houses down from us in PSR. That might give you a clue of who I am. I have Mark. I was so grateful to Marcus to introducing us to the Jesus Seminar, and later on, after I became a pastor, I started attending Jesus seminars, and I'm very grateful to you, Brandon. I've enjoyed your books. I've enjoyed your presentations, and I did have a question for you, with starting from the point of saying, I enjoyed what you said about storytelling and how important that is to understanding all of these topics. And so I was taken by your comments about John Shelby Spong, and I was going to ask you to do a similar reaction to Don Coupet. And because of his interest in language, which parallels yours, and especially the language of life, although I think he was more of a philosopher in his approach to that. And so I wondered if you had any comments that you might make about him.
Yeah, I really like Coupet's work, and I think he's one of the most important English theologians of the 20th century. Wow. I think he's been sadly overlooked because he didn't go in the Orthodox tradition. And he was succeeded at Cambridge by the New Orthodoxy, which has been a disaster. So, but Coupet ended up in a kind of interesting place. He kind of ended up as a Zen monk, basically, is where he comes out when you run through the whole thing. But Coupet is one of those, like Mark Taylor in the United States, one of those theologians who's willing to ask the radical question.
Mm.
And as a result, he begins to dissolve theology into philosophy.
Uh-huh. Mhm.
Now, Caputo does a similar kind of thing, except Jack starts as a philosopher and stays one. So you don't have this same kind of transition in Caputo that you do in Don Cupid. And Cupid has a more, I'm not sure I want to say this, I'm not sure it's fair. I'll just say, I think Caputo really does, the Zen allows him to maneuver into a kind of monastic, everything ends up in a kind of pantheism of a sort. I don't want to push that too far because he's very careful about how he goes there. But I think he's really theologically and philosophically asking the right set of questions and the really interesting set of questions. And one of the things I like about Caputo is about Cupid, he didn't write long books. They're
Yes.
all short.
Yeah.
And they follow his evolution as a person as he reaches towards death. And I found that to be very useful for me because I've gone through the same kind of process.
He kind of writes in a Wittgenstein. He's not as Wittgenstein sometimes seems to me just, you can't understand him. You can always understand what Caputo is saying, but he likes the kind of aphoristic style, and he's good at it and phrasing the sharp way, so you don't get lost in the explanation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. Maybe we have time for one more, and then we'll then we really need to close our time today.
Yeah, it's nice to see all the interest. There's lots of.
Isn't it though? Yeah, lovely.
Jennifer Malevsky, is that correct?
Oh, yes, very good. Very impressed. So I know I'm frozen on my screen. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm grappling with what you talked about institutionality, about how, like once something becomes a thing, it begins to die. And I think that we here have been doing a whole lot of deconstruction, which I think is, again, the same thing, like resisting something becoming a thing, staying in the inquiry. But I grapple with that because I'm like, okay, so if you have no thingness, then how do you have continuity? And if you don't want continuity, which, that's possible. That means like perhaps that this Jesus religion doesn't stay alive like in the realm of continuity, but does it then just end up kind of at the super local level? Like, lots of home communities, lots of home churches, like doing their own, forming their own charism and like that, and are there any practices that unite us? Are there any ethics that unite us? Or do we let go of being united? Anyway, I'm just curious about how this plays out.
I think, my flippant kind of answer would be it worked for the first 200 years. But there's another side of this too. I mean, the question you're asking is what kind of model do you want to use? And I tend to move towards the Darwinian model. Because in the Darwinian model, one of the interesting things about Darwin is Darwin's fundamental contribution was the rejection of Plato. And Plato's still our problem. Plato tells us there's an essence, and we have to find that essence, and that essence develops and it continues. And that's what I'm not attacking you. That's what your question is implying. The itness, the thingness is Plato's essence. Darwin says there's no such thing as an essence. There's nothing to develop. If you look at evolutionary biology, there's no such thing as a species. The species is a collection of a population. It's the characteristics of a population, and there'll be a range. So that at either end of that range, they have little in common. In the middle, they got a lot of common, but on either end, they don't. As a birder, I can tell you, you see this all the time. You look at enough red-tailed hawks and you realize they look a whole lot different. But in the middle, they all look alike. They all got a red tail.
Interesting.
So if you follow Plato's model, then there's some continuing essence, some thingness, some itness that has to develop and has to be unchanging, that goes on and on. If you follow Darwin's model, it's a population, that all kind of coheres and belong, but is different. And there's a lot of range of difference. And as it moves, it changes and becomes different things. So I'm much more persuaded by Darwin's model. I think it's a more plastic model, a more fluid model, and it's based on reality. Plato's model is based on ideation.
Yeah.
It's a thought problem. So that's just been the kind of way I've been pushing the thinking. And if you read the book After Jesus and Before Christianity, if you read carefully, you'll see Darwin's motto is constantly resisting the thingness, and you get descriptions of varieties of how things are. So that's a more Darwinian model. The problem with Darwin's model is you can't answer your question. See, because there's no thing there. And, when I first started pushing in the Christianity seminar that there's no such thing as Christianity, and people would say, well, yeah, but what are we going to call it? Well, there's no it, so you can't call it. But it's easier to talk about it if you can call it something and make it an it, then you can talk about it. Well, then you're back to the problem of speciation. You have to describe its characteristics. That's why you want to describe social location and what's going on. You need this rich, thick description of what it is so that it's not an it.
Okay. Great.
Thank you.
All
Thank-
things change, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that right, Brandon?
Pardon me?
All things change?
All things change,
All things change.
even species of birds.
Or they die.
Yeah, all things change.
In birders, you got one quick second?
Yes,
Among
of course.
birders, you have what are called, birders keep life lists, how many birds you've seen. And species keep changing. So that, right now we have the dark-eyed junco. Well, the Oregon junco doesn't look anything like the slate junco. They're clearly two different species, but right now they're classified as one. So lumpers think that's one, and separators think that's two species. Well, we'll eventually have two more species, maybe three more species of juncos, because it's an arbitrary distinction. You're describing characteristic of populations. And so you keep moving the boundaries of those things because they're, as Darwin said, species really aren't real. But you need a kind of box to put them in. So you put this box here, but on the edges, it's closer to this other thing. So same thing happens in the analysis of institutions.
Yeah, love it. Great. Brandon, thank you. Thank you so much. I
It's
will
been my
look forward
pleasure.
to having you back again.
It's been a real joy.
Good, good. For me too. And I'm going to send you all off today with a brief benediction. Marcus, the pastor who married Marcus and myself used to send his congregation off with this, and then Marcus took it on the road and made it famous. Then I'll give you a brief version of it. Life is short, and we do not have much time to gladden the hearts of those who travel the way with us. So be swift to love and make haste to be kind. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.